So now that we have supply and demand, we understand them, and we combine them together to look at what equilibrium is, we can use these ideas to analyze individual markets. So the method we're using is called comparative statics analysis. So this is going to be a common technique that we use throughout this textbook. But comparative statics is a fairly simple idea. So it's not very complex. It's a form of what they call sensitivity analysis or what-if analysis. So the process that we're going to work with. The first thing we want to do is state all the assumptions that we need to construct the model. Again, because the model has to abstract from the real world, we have to simplify it, or else there'll be just too much to work with and we won't be able to understand the effect of changing the variables that we actually want to look at. We need to make simplifying assumptions. So we state those in the beginning. Then we begin by assuming the model is in equilibrium. So a couple slides ago, we had the market in equilibrium, supply and demand. Where those cross, that price and that quantity is where we're starting. We're going to start with that for our comparative statics analysis. Again, because it's simple and it helps us understand what's going on. Then what we're going to do is introduce a change in the model. Now move the market out of equilibrium, create a disequilibrium. So basically, we will either shift the supply curve or the demand curve. From there, we find a new point of equilibrium. Again, very simple, just where the two new supply and demand curves cross each other. And then we'll compare the new equilibrium point to the original one. So we'll see what happens to the price that's being bought and sold at, what happens to the quantity being bought and sold. Okay, so let's walk through an example that makes a lot more sense to actually see it being done than trying to describe this in abstract. So we'll continue with our analysis of pizza. And we'll go through each step, work step by step through what we just covered. So let's first start by assuming all the factors except the price of pizza are held constant. So the 5 things that shift, or the 5 non-price determinants of demand and supply, are all going to be held constant at the beginning of this example. Only thing that can change is the price of pizza. We can move up and down the supply curve and up and down the demand curve based on whatever the price is. We're also going to assume that buyer's demand and seller's supply are represented by the lines shown. Again, we don't know for a fact what supply and demand is, but let's pretend that we did some sort of estimation based on past sales, and we came up with these supply and demand curves, which are likely close, but definitely not exactly what the supply and demand curves actually would be if we could figure them out. So as we noted in step 2, we're going to begin the analysis in equilibrium. So we're going to start with the price of P1. P1 equals $4 per unit. So I guess it's too expensive to be a slice of pizza. So I guess for like a small personal pizza. And the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied is going to be 300 units. So they'll be the same again because we're in equilibrium. There's the same number of units being supplied and demanded on the market. All right, so now we get into the real meat, the actual analysis and our comparative statics. So let's introduce a change in one of the assumptions made when the model was constructed. So we said that all factors except for price are being held constant. Let's change one of those. Let's assume this is a market for pizza around St. Francis. And let's say that consumer income increases. So students get their refund check near the beginning of the semester. So it's going to increase their income. What happens when there's an increase in income? When consumer income increases, that's going to shift the demand curve to the right. That's going to increase the quantity demanded at each price. So what we do is shift the demand curve to the right, move it from D1 to D2. So as a result, consumers are going to increase their demand for pizza. Okay, so we know we shifted the demand curve to the right because consumer income increased. But now what happens? As we shift in the demand curve, there's going to be a new equilibrium price and a new equilibrium quantity being bought and sold. So the new equilibrium price is P2. That's going to be where the supply curve and that new demand curve, D2, cross each other. That price is going to be midway between $4 and $5, so let's say $4.50. So the equilibrium price increases from $4 to $4.50. At this new price, there's going to be a change in the quantity being bought and sold. In this case, it's going to move from 300 units being sold to 350 units being sold. So we have this new quantity and the new price. So now we compare the new equilibrium point with the original equilibrium point. So what happens when there is an increase in consumer income that shifts the demand curve to the right? So in this case, we move from D1 to D2, and it changes both the price, changes the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. So the equilibrium price increases from $4 to $4.50 in this case. And the equilibrium quantity being bought and sold increases from 300 to 350 units. Therefore, we can say that when the demand curve shifts to the right, when consumer income increases, both the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity increase. All right, so what would happen if firms tried to keep the price at $4 instead of increasing it to the new equilibrium price? Well, if they kept the price at $4, tracing out the P1 at $4 all the way out to the new demand curve at D2, that would be about 450 units. So consumers would want to purchase 450 units of pizza, but firms would only be willing and able to produce 300 units. So we'd end up with a shortage. You'd have consumers lined up waiting to get pizza and not able to. So in response, firms would want to increase production. But in order to increase production, they're going to have to increase their prices because the costs are going to increase as they produce more. So as firms begin increasing their production of pizza, that's going to increase the price of pizza. As they increase the price, they're producing more. As the price increases, consumers are going to move along that demand curve and be willing to purchase less and less. Eventually, that's going to move until consumers are willing to purchase the same amount that firms are willing and able to produce, in this case at $4.50. And if firms made the mistake and they moved past it and accidentally produced too much, sold at too high of a price, they would have a surplus. They'd have extra pizzas left over, and they would know that they'd have to lower their price in order to sell them. So price will settle at the equilibrium price, and we'll end up with what the equilibrium price we also call the market clearing price, where there's no leftover units and there's no consumers left in a shortage trying to get goods and services that aren't available. Now it's important that we explain the difference between the short run and the long run. So the short run is not any particular amount of time. We don't define it as 6 weeks or 6 months or 2 years. We define the short run as a period in time in which sellers already in the market respond to changes in equilibrium price by adjusting their inputs, and buyers in the market respond to changes in equilibrium by adjusting the quantity demanded for a good or service. So the short run is just the period of time in which those already in the market are able to adjust to market changes. So this comparative static analysis we just did highlights the rationing function of price in the short run. So the rationing function of price is the change in the market price that occurs to eliminate the imbalance between the quantity supplied and demanded. So basically, if there's a shortage, the price increases, decreasing the quantity demanded, increasing the supply until we reach equilibrium. Likewise, if there's a surplus, that pushes down on the price, and as the price decreases, that's going to decrease the amount that's being supplied to the market by firms. It's going to increase consumer demand. It's going to eliminate those surpluses. So what happens when there's an increase in demand? Like in the example that we just walked through, an increase in demand causes the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity to rise. That can be represented by the figure here on the right, where the demand curve shifts to the right. If we stayed at the original price, there'd be a shortage. So price is going to increase from P1 to P2, and the quantity being bought and sold on the market is going to increase from Q1 to Q2. If the price remained at D2, the quantity being bought and sold on the market quantity demanded would increase to Q3, but the quantity supplied would remain at Q1. So we would have a shortage, which is the difference between those two quantities. Now, what happens if the opposite thing occurs, if we see a decrease in the demand curve or a shift in the demand curve to the left? So that's going to cause the equilibrium price and quantity to fall. Now, if it didn't, if price remained the same, we'd end up with a surplus. Consumers are willing and able to purchase fewer goods, but at that old price, the previous higher price, firms would not be willing to decrease their output. So we'd end up with a lot of extra goods left on the market. What happens? That's going to put downward pressure on prices because firms have all these extra units sitting around. And when you have a lot of inventory sitting around, the best way to get rid of it is to lower the price that you're charging consumers. I'll put downward pressure on the price, moving it from P1 to P2, decreasing the quantity that's being bought and sold on the market from Q1 to Q2. So we end up at the new equilibrium point where D2, the new demand curve after the shift in demand, equals the supply curve or crosses the supply curve. Now let's turn to changes in supply. So let's say there's an increase in the supply curve. An increase in supply or shifting the supply curve to the right is going to cause the equilibrium price to fall and the equilibrium quantity demanded to increase. Now what would happen if price didn't change? So if initially price doesn't change, at P1, when the supply curve shifts, firms are going to be willing and able to supply a lot more of the good or service to the market. What we'll end up with is a surplus. So at the initial price, consumers are only willing and able to purchase Q1, but there are now a lot more on the market, which isn't represented by anything on this figure. When there's that surplus, again, there's downward pressure on prices. Firms are going to have to lower the price in order to get rid of all their inventory. So what's going to happen is, as the price falls, we're going to move along the demand curve from P1 and Q1 all the way down to Q2 when the price finally falls to P2, which is the new equilibrium price. At the same time, as the price starts to fall, firms are going to move along the supply curve. They're going to produce and be willing to sell fewer and fewer units of that good because, again, they're getting a lower price for it. So now it's, because it's more expensive to produce more of a good, as the price begins to fall, they're going to have to produce less of that good. And it's going to move all the way down until price falls to P2, where the demand curve crosses the new supply curve. So P2, and then the quantity bought and sold is going to be Q2. So lower price than before, but a higher quantity being bought and sold. And finally, if the opposite occurs, if there's a decrease in the supply, or shift in the supply curve to the left, the equilibrium price is going to rise, and the equilibrium quantity being bought and sold in the market is going to fall. So again, we initially start out in P1, which is our first equilibrium condition. The supply curve shifts to the left. If we don't change the price, that's going to substantially decrease the quantity that firms are willing and able to produce and bring to the market. At that initial lower price, consumers are going to have the same amount of demand. So demand stays at Q1 when the quantity quantity being sold on the market that firms are willing to bring to the market is going to fall below Q2. So it's going to fall even farther. At the lower price, there's going to be a shortage, or at that initial price, there will be a shortage. So what that's going to incentivize firms to do is to increase their prices. So as firms begin to increase their prices, they're now producing more. They're moving along the S2 supply curve. And consumers are moving along the demand curve, D1, as the price increases. That's going to continue until the price reaches P2. At P2, that's where the new supply curve crosses the demand curve. So the quantity Q2 is going to be the same quantity being supplied by firms and being demanded by consumers. So in our example, we were looking at what happens in the short run. Now, we can also look at what happens as a result of the shift in the supply and demand curve in the long run. The long run is a period of time in which new sellers can enter a market or existing sellers can exit the market. So you have new firms jumping in, competing in that market, or existing firms leaving the market. So existing sellers can adjust fixed factors of production. So if contracts are locked into for a long time, maybe they're locked into their production facility for, say a 10-year lease. In the long run, they're able to adjust those factors that are fixed in the short run. So in this case, it'll be the long run is 10 years when they're able to move to new facilities, larger or smaller facilities. And also, buyers can react to a change in equilibrium by changing their tastes and preferences. In the short run, people react by purchasing more or less of a good, but over the long run, if those price changes remain permanent, people's tastes and preferences begin to change as they get used to the new goods that they're consuming. So in the short run, we were looking at the rationing function of price. Now in the long run, this shows the allocating function of price. So the allocating function of price is the movement of resources into or out of markets in response to a change in the equilibrium price. So we're not talking about, like in the short run, what's going on within the market. This is looking at the supply in the long run. So for the example of looking at the pizza shop, in the long run, if consumer demand is increasing, we'll end up seeing more supply in the market. Resources move from producing other foods like hot dogs and hamburgers into the market for pizza. So we're talking about the overall allocation of goods within the economy versus the rationing of the existing goods amongst different consumers and the existing consumers. All right, so let's look at long-run static analysis. So we're assuming that the initial change in the market was a decrease in demand. So we're shifting the demand curve from D1 to D2. So let's say the example is a market for hot dogs and pizza. As the demand curve for pizza increased, it shifted to the right because consumers' income increased. So now, the St. Francis students, in this case, the consumers in the market, they're consuming more pizza because they have more money. Let's say that hot dogs are an inferior good. They're the type of good that you only purchase when you don't have a lot of money. So as consumer income increase, they're going to demand less hot dogs. So in this case, we initially have that downward shift in demand. So the equilibrium price moves from P1 to P2, so it falls, and the quantity being bought and sold falls to Q2. Now, what's going to happen in the long run? In the short run, we're just going to see that adjustment we talked about earlier. In the long run, there's a decreased price in hot dogs. That's going to cause some sellers to exit the market or to reduce the amount they're selling in the market. Some may go bankrupt. Some may just decide to focus on other types of food or other products. So resources are leaving the market for hot dogs. What happens when this occurs? When resources leave because either firms are exiting the market or they're decreasing their lines of production, things like that. We're going to see the long run supply, or over the long run, we will see the supply shift to the left. So we'll move from supply curve S1 to S2. These resources are going to continue leaving the market, and producers will continue to decrease their production or leave the market entirely until the price rises back up to the initial equilibrium price. So the new equilibrium price, P3, is going to be the same as the initial equilibrium price, P1. And the quantity being bought and sold in the market is going to continue to decrease. They're going to move from Q2 to Q3 as the price begins, again, to increase. Now let's go back to the market for pizza in the long run. Our initial change was shifting the demand curve to the right, moving from D1 to D2. So remember what that did is it increased the price from P1 to P2 and increased the quantity demanded from Q1 to Q2. So now we have pizzas being sold at higher prices, but we see more pizzas being sold on the market. Now, as firms see that there is more money to be made in making pizza, what they're going to do is they're going to increase the amount they sell. They're going to increase their ability to produce, so buy more capital equipment. So if you're a pizza shop buying a new pizza oven, new firms are going to enter the market, new pizza stands are going to open. So using the St. Francis example, we have whatever the new name for MVP is in town. We have that one pizza shop right by the football field. Maybe the LPG will start, selling pizzas and making a big deal about their pizza. Maybe Smith Myers will get into the game. Maybe a new restaurant will open. So we'll see new entrants enter the market. What happens when there's an increase in the number of sellers? That's going to shift the supply curve to the right. That's going to increase the supply. So in the long run, we'll see the supply curve shift to the right in response to a shift in the demand curve. So in the market overall, that's going to decrease the price, bring it down from P1 to P3, which P3 is equal to the initial equilibrium price, P1. That's also going to increase the quantity being bought and sold on the market. Because the supply curve shifts to the right, that's going to increase the supply. So we end up with a Q3, a new equilibrium quantity being bought and sold, which is much greater than the initial, or even the short run change in equilibrium, Q2. And this long run analysis highlights how prices changing in the short run are a signal and an incentive for owners of the factors of production, so the owners of different firms or potential firms that could be started. So because we see the price increase in the market for pizza, because of the increase in consumer demand, the shift in the right of the demand curve, there's now a profit opportunity in the market for pizzas. So we have more firms enter the market, or existing firms expand their productive capabilities, purchasing more capital equipment, so they're able to produce more pizzas. So the price system and the profit and loss mechanism, what it does is it guides how firms decide to allocate their production, and it guides how the economy as a whole or society as a whole, what they produce and how much they produce. Likewise, because the price falls in the market for hot dogs in this instance, in this example, we see firms begin to leave that market because they're not able to earn a profit or their profits are much smaller. They go into other industries. In this case, pizza. They may also go and produce other things as well, because the profit that they're earning in the market for hot dogs has fallen. So again, the price mechanism, the profit and loss mechanism, these encourage firms to offer the goods and services that consumers actually want, that that actually provide value to people. And it's a feedback mechanism. So when they're wrong in the short run, you see more hot dogs being produced than are in the long run, because consumers don't really want that anymore. So it prevents resources from being wasted in ways that don't really meet consumer needs or aren't the best way to meet consumer needs. All right, so this comes from table 3.6 in your textbook, just summarizing the initial change and what happens in the long run. And it's important when you work through these assignments to show what happens in the short run, show that initial change in the short run time period, and then separately show what the follow-on changes in the long run. And do it just like we did with the previous example, if you combine them. So first show the initial shift in the demand curve, then show the eventual shift in the supply curve. Rather than trying to do it all in the same graph and explain it all at once, make it clear that this is the short run change, this is what initially happens, and then this is the long run change as a result of the changing short run conditions. But now to summarize these relationships, an increase in demand causes prices to rise in the short run. In the long run, supply is going to increase as new sellers enter the market, and original sellers increase their productive capacity. So we move back to the initial equilibrium price, but we end up at a new quantity being bought and sold. Now in the short run time period, an initial change when there's a decrease in demand, that's going to cause prices to fall. In the long run, supply is going to decrease as less profitable firms or firms that are experiencing losses are going to exit the market or decrease their productive capacity, shift their resources from that failing market to a market where they can achieve more financial success. Another example is an increase in supply causes prices to fall in the short run period. In the long run, eventually demand is going to increase as tastes and preferences of consumers eventually change, moving towards the product, this relatively cheaper product, compared to substitutes. So as the price falls, consumers are going to be willing in the long run to purchase more because it's relatively cheaper. And eventually that changes their tastes and preferences. And finally, when there's an initial decrease in supply, that's going to cause the price of the product to rise. Eventually, demand is going to decrease as tastes and preferences of consumers change away from this new, more expensive product and towards relatively cheaper substitutes. So in extreme cases, supply and demand, those market forces, are the sole determinants of the market price. No single firm has any impact whatsoever on the market price. If they tried to sell at a higher price, they would not sell any units. And if they tried to sell at a lower price, they would sell, the same number of units, but they would earn a lower profit themselves. This is called perfect competition. This is very rare. So this is like the market for goods that are completely homogeneous, that there's no difference between where you buy them. So things like agricultural goods are the best example of this. In the real world, though, in most markets, individual firms have some sort of market power. And maybe because of their size, they may be a monopoly, or there may only be a few firms in that industry. Like automakers, there's only a couple car firms, so it's not very competitive. In contrast to a perfectly competitive market where there's a ton of producers. Other times firms have market power because of their ability to differentiate their products. So they have like a mini monopoly in their good and service. There's a bunch of different companies that make cell phones. Now, I have an Android, but most people tell me that nothing compares to Apple. So Apple has a mini monopoly on the types of things that they offer. And there's other things you can do. It might be advertising, it might be their brand name, maybe features they offer, or services that accompany those products. But there's a lot of way for them to create some sort of market power. All right, so to summarize the basic elements of supply and demand that we talked about in this chapter, the law of demand states that with everything else being held constant, the quantity demanded is inversely related to the price. So as the price increases, the quantity demanded by consumers is going to fall. Now the law of supply states that everything else being held equal, the quantity supplied is directly related to the price. So as the price increases, the quantity supplied is going to increase, and vice versa. A change in the price does not shift the demand curve, it moves along the demand curve. Non-price factors are what shifts the demand curves and supply curves. So they can shift the curves to the left, which is decrease, or shift to the right and increase. Now in the short run, prices serve in the rationing function. So they determine who is going to get what goods, who's willing and able to purchase it, what prices they're being sold at. Now prices in the long run guide the marketplace. So they guide the allocation of resources. What industry are we going to use these resources to produce in?